see every time now, so it takes an extra few minutes to do that. Okay. Okay, well, welcome to day 2 of the All Work and No Play workshop. We're very excited now to have Dr. Diana-Elena Popescu, who was until recently at King's and is now at Edinburgh Uni. She works on distributive justice, recognition theory, the relation between the two, and she'll be speaking today about this topic, leisure for everybody. So thanks very much, Diana. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope you'll enjoy this talk, which looks at the history of the introduction of a 5-day work week, and I'll be analyzing the different motivations that existed for that shift at the time, and I'll be comparing that to the motivations that are now being discussed for introducing a 4-day work week, and I'll be contrasting the two motivations in the case of disability in particular. So if we can move on to the outline. Thank you very much for that. So the first thing that I will be discussing is the historical context in which the 5-day work week was proposed, and the two different sets of motivations, as I was mentioning earlier, and then I will try to demonstrate that the initial motivations for introducing the 5-day work week were ableist. And for this, I'll be, first of all, defining disability, and I'll be focusing on the case of dyspraxia, in particular for reasons that I will reveal at the time. And I will show how the disadvantages that are associated with being dyspraxic are partially created by the 5-day work week model. And then I will look at the current proposals for introducing a 4-day work week as a possible remedy for the disadvantages that are created for dyspraxics by the 5-day work week, and I will contrast two models that the 4-day work week can have: a less of the same model in which we operate within many of the assumptions of the 5-day work week, but we just have those for a limited number of hours, and an inclusive model in which we use the push for a 4-day work week as a starting point for requiring more inclusive working conditions, which will benefit dyspraxics alongside other people suffering from various disabilities. So moving on now to the historical context. Thank you. Next slide, please. Right, what better place to start than Karl Marx? Also because he has done a great service in saving all these other accounts that describe the situation of working people before the introduction of the 5-day work week. And I have focused on the case of children. So in chapter 10 of the first volume of the Capital, where Marx discusses the structure of the working week, we have this news piece from the Daily Telegraph that says children of 9 or 10 years are dragged from their squalid beds at 2, 3, or 4 o'clock in the morning and compelled to work for a bare subsistence until 10, 11, or 12 at night, their limbs wearing away, their frames dwindling, their faces withering, and their humanity absolutely sinking into a stone-like torpor. And the situation of children during that time is, of course, one of the main horrors that we associate with an unregulated working week. And then in chapter 31 of the first volume of The Capital, Marx talks about the rise of the industrialist and explains how that happens on the back of people working in insane hours. And we again have a focus on children in an account that says the profits of manufacturers were enormous, but this only whetted the appetite that it should have satisfied. And therefore, the manufacturers had recourse to an expedient that seemed to secure to them those profits without any possibility of limit. They began the practice of what is termed night working. So this is again about children. That is, having tired one set of hands by working them throughout the day, they had another set ready to go on working throughout the night. The day set getting into the beds that the night set had just quitted, and in their turn again the night set getting into the beds that the day set quitted in the morning. It is a common tradition in Lancashire that the beds never get cold, which is a very gruesome understanding of a warm bed waiting for you at night. I've read this passage several years ago, but it stayed with me. And again, we have to remember the fact that these are children, and that there was no limit to the number of hours that even children were required to work. If we move on now to the next account, we'll see that one of the effects of this style of working was indeed disability. And because this is a new project that I'm working on, I'm still gathering evidence. I'm in conversation now with someone who works on child unions, and I'm trying to gather more evidence that children in unions were aware of the lifelong effects of these hours. But what I have so far is an account that appears in a defense by Sydney Webb from the Sydney and Beatrice Webb and Harold Cox, who in 1891 offered a defense, but also a history of the existing struggles for the 8 hours day. And this is an account sent by a 22-year-old grocer's assistant upon the publication of a little volume called Death and Disease Behind the Counter. And this grocer's assistant wanted to make his own situation known. And he says, I have been working in 3 places since I was 15 years of age. My hours have been and are from 7:30 a.m. to 9:30 p.m., Fridays to 10 p.m., Saturdays 12 p.m., by which is meant midnight. At the end of the day, my feet burn and my limbs ache. On Saturday, it is something cruel. We have no holidays. I have known one death through the long hours, and many a one I have known broken down and obliged to leave. It's very hard to have one's health ruined at the very beginning of life, and then having to go through life with half a constitution. So again, I'm still gathering evidence, but it seems that the effects on child labor were to have many people then going on through the rest of their lives with what this grocer's assistant calls half a constitution. So suffering from some disability that makes the rest of the person's working life and of course personal life very difficult indeed to bear. If we move on now. Thank you. We'll see, and this is also the sad conclusion if we know what happened to the little manifesto of Webb and Cox. We see that these kinds of accounts were not the defining move for giving up the insane 100-week, 120-hour week of work in favor of the more reduced number we have now, but rather what changed things were experiments by industrialists. So an early but slightly lesser known industrialist was Ernst Abbe, who worked at the Zeiss factory in Jena, Germany. and he is credited by psychologists in productivity at the time. So this is a book about the psychology of productivity written in 1913, as having created a trend among industrialists to conduct these experiments with productivity to see what they. No worries. I'm thinking, maybe, I think I can request control, so I can definitely try to do that. Right, so I've requested control, and I think this means that I'll be able to move the slides myself. So thank you so much, Alex.
Sorry.
You've been. No, I didn't realize. I think I panicked, but yeah, this was always a possibility. So thank you. Thank you, Alex. All right, so it seems that in the end, it was the experiments of these industrialists that really made it click that the 120-hour work week was not such a good idea. So in this book on the psychology of productivity from 1913, Ernst Abbe is credited with having written many years ago that the shortening from 9 to 8 hours, that is a cutting down of more than 10%, did not involve a reduction of the day's product, but an increase, and that this increase did not result from any supplementary efforts. This conviction of Abbe still seems to hold true after millions of experiments over the whole globe. So this is from 1913, but the most famous industrialist associated with experiments in productivity is Henry Ford in the United States, and he experimented first with monetary incentives in 1914, and I found this wonderful piece in the New York Times in which he says, I'm no philanthropist, that's not why I'm sharing profits, it's because I want to increase productivity. And of course in 1926, that's when he concluded his experiments with on productivity and found that the 8-hour work week provided maximum productivity, despite what people might have thought, which is 120 hours gets you more than 40 hours, because there were fewer accidents, because there were fewer people dropping out of the labor force, and things like that. So this moment, Henry Ford's conclusion of the experiments on productivity in 1926 is seen by many as the moment in which the 40-hour work week divided into 5 days that we have now became mainstream. Oh no. Okay. All right, it is working then. So we have two stories, as it were, about why we needed to move to a 5-day work week, but also why it happened. We have the story of working hours before the 5-day work week as a story of markets using labor beyond what the body can bear. And this is a pretty tragic story, not only because of all the accounts that we have, and some of which I've just quoted to you, but also because apparently it was impossible for strikes and unions and also political initiatives to stop this trend. And then we have the story of working hours before the 5-day work week as a story of markets inefficiently using labor beyond what the body can bear. And it was this inefficiency that finally made it stick, that we needed to end the practice of 120, 100 hours working weeks. So it was in the end utility for employers that made the change stick, and it just so happens that the highest productivity for employers also coincided with the demands for an 8-hour for working for only 8 hours a day. Why is this relevant? That we have the two motivations, and it was the one based on efficiency that won the day. Well, because now that we have discussions of a 4-day work week, there is a danger again at focusing only on the efficiency argument. There are, as I will be discussing in the course of the presentation, many advantages, of course, to discovering that the 4-day work week also increases efficiency. But I want to say that there is a danger in losing sight of some of the other arguments as well and only focusing on efficiency. So current arguments for the work week also emphasize productivity and what makes the move to a 4-day work week efficient for employers. And this is, of course, very important for the how question, for what would make the 4-day work week possible, feasible. And as you can see in the reports on experiments on introducing a 4-day work week in Iceland, we have, and this is the blue rectangle there. We have focused on productivity. So productivity remained the same or improved in the majority of workplaces, researchers have said, following their analysis of data collected between 2015 and 2019. But my argument is that in simply emulating 1920s style arguments for efficiency, together with the experiments that we do on productivity in factories and things like that, we lose sight of inclusivity. So this is the why question. And I will be focusing on the example of disability to show how focusing on efficiency versus inclusivity leads us different results. And here's where I begin the first substantive discussion, which is a discussion of the 40-hour work week as an ableist institution. And for this, of course, we have to start by defining disability, which is tricky because depending on what people's interests are, they tend to focus on different kinds of disabilities, because you actually have a continuum of instances from disabilities consisting in irreducible pain and suffering at one end to inconveniences that are almost exclusively socially caused that can be dealt with by rearranging the social environment. So an example of the latter would be disabilities that are due primarily to our chosen way of communication. The deaf community is very proud of their way of communicating and advocates for being seen as enjoying just as rich a life as people who are able to hear. And there's a wonderful chapter called the Dyslexia Manifesto, in which someone who works with dyslexic children, trying to get them to break down their wonderful verbal skills into writing, advocates for the fact that there's actually something lost when you do this, because the immense capacity of dyslexic people to play with verbal words is a bit like an art. So we are losing out when we are forcing dyslexic people to communicate primarily in writing, whereas if we were to be instead in a society that would favor oral communication, we wouldn't have many of these difficulties. So this is one end of the spectrum, but of course you do have disabilities consisting of irreducible pain and suffering. And there's an entire literature on whether it is moral to cause disability, saying, well, it's not moral, and what that shows you is that there is something that's intrinsically bad with having a disability. I think it's important to give an account of the whole continuum when trying to define disability, and for this reason, I will adopt Tom Shakespeare's interactive model, which allows that there is an irreducible element to disability, while at the same time agreeing with the so-called social model of disability that most of the disadvantages we have associated with certain impairments are socially produced. So for Tom Shakespeare, there can be no impairment without society, nor disability without impairment. So you need society to even make sense of impairment, understood as something that's irreducibly bad in the case of disability, and you have this impairment as a necessary component of disability. Why is impairment partially a social construct? Well, Shakespeare provides several arguments for this, some being that social conditions tend to generate disability. Poverty, for instance, is one social condition that is associated with developing an entire host of disabilities, from learning difficulties to more serious, for instance, losses of mobility, because the tendency to have more accidents is higher. But at a more fundamental level, the reasoning is that impairment is not an objective fact, but depends on social judgment to become visible, and depends on social processes in order to become salient. And this is where the interactive model agrees with the social model in saying that social processes play an instrumental role in turning impairments into the serious, pervasive, sometimes reinforcing types of disadvantages that are associated with having a disability. But also, unlike the pure, let's say, social model, for instance, the human variation model that says there's no such thing as impairment, on Tom Shakespeare's interactive model, we have an irreducible biological dimension that sometimes operates alongside the social, the social one. And to identify this, this element, when it is indeed part of disability, we need to think in terms of the most inclusive, the most accessible possible world, and see whether we would still have some form of disadvantages associated with a feature even in that world. So some disabilities might disappear completely if we think about the most accessible world. Dyslexia would probably be one of them, but there are others, fibromyalgia, for instance, in which you would still have the pain and suffering associated with the disease, regardless of changes in social circumstances. And I have chosen on a disability that falls that is not entirely reducible and would fall somewhere along, I would say, the middle of this continuum, and that is dyspraxia, which is a visual, perceptual and motor coordination difficulty that's also associated with more subtle difficulties with internal organization at the levels of perception and thought. And you have a host of problems such as spatial orientation, problems with fine motor skills, word retrieval, memory and concentration, organization in writing a text, for instance, but also related to organization problems in time keeping, which causes a host of problems for dyspraxic people when they navigate daily lives. For instance, due to problems of spatial orientation, there are difficulties in navigating maps, following instructions, finding a new place if you have an appointment, for instance. Due to the fine motor skills problems, you will probably have problems putting on makeup, using household appliances. Handwriting is a problem, so using a word processor is one of the most common reasonable accommodations that you have for dyspraxia. You have problems finding and articulating words, which causes communication difficulties. From poor organization and concentration arise problems in planning, structuring, and sequencing tasks, hence also the time-keeping problems. And some of these are overlapping. Slow speed of writing and reading from various causes. Problems tasking, which, you know, a lot of us can have problems multitasking, but for dyspraxics, this includes problems in reading a text and comprehending it at the same time because of memory difficulties, and also sensory sensitivity. So bright lights or having a continuous sound in the room are very distracting for a person with dyspraxia. And there are, in the labor market, a host of reasonable accommodations that are recommended, and some workplaces implement this, although these interventions are local. So one of the most common things that you do in workplaces if you want to accommodate dyspraxic people is to mitigate coordination issues through more user-friendly appliances. So use electric staplers that don't require fine motor skills, introduce elevators, because dyspraxic people also have problems walking sometimes, and they sprain their ankles all the time, for instance. You can balance out tasks so that when there is a task requiring increased coordination, you get another worker to do that task, and then the dyspraxic person does something that's more comfortable for them in exchange. Adjustment for typing, so being allowed to use a word processor, making sure as an employer that you record instructions and check all the time that the dyspraxic employee understands those instructions, as well as allowing breaks to a quiet area from time to time to be away from noise and sounds, at least for a few minutes of the day, and be able to concentrate, as well as a body system doing yoga, things like that. But as you can see, there's nothing in here about radically reshaping the work environment as a whole that would fit into the definition of disability as something that is at least partially produced by social institutions. So here is where the analysis of dyspraxia in relation to the structure of the work week becomes interesting. This is also where I answered the question that many of you might have had, which is why dyspraxia? Well, there's a utility-based argument for focusing on dyspraxics because 5% of the adult population is thought to have dyspraxic traits, according to a UK trade union. Other accounts place that at 10% of the population, but the agreed upon figure is that around 1.6 million workers in the UK are dyspraxic. And also dyspraxics have recently come under attention following all these studies about the importance of diversity of thinking at work, because it's the most efficient way to get the diversity of thinking at work, to hire a dyspraxic person because of these lateral thinking. So when you make an argument for the epistemic virtue of the diversity, you usually have different people, each with different experiences, so being able to pick up on different details, if it's a problem-solving exercise, for instance. With dyspraxics, you get all of it, because there is such a flexibility in a dyspraxic's way of thinking. It's easy for them to tune down the focus on detail or to rearrange things into different patterns. It's difficult to stop that, but they are naturals at doing this. So in light with all these studies of productivity, dyspraxics have come under attention because you get one employer who's a dyspraxic, and then you have all the benefits that were proven to exist in the literature on having diverse thinkers. So there's a strong utility argument for why you want to integrate dyspraxics better into the workforce. And there's also an inclusivity-based argument, because many of the problems that dyspraxics have to do with timekeeping, organization, coordination, and all these disadvantages are partially a product of how social environments and especially work environments are organized. So there will of course be residual disadvantages in the case of dyspraxia. This is why it's not like some of the easier cases that disability advocates like to focus on sometimes. So even in the most accessible possible world, you can have a dyspraxic person, I don't know, cooking soup and then getting burned because because they are clumsy. So fine motor skills will forever be a problem. So would be planning tasks. And if you want autonomy, if you want dyspraxic people to plan their day, then this will be a problem regardless of how accessible you make the external environment. So dyspraxia is a very good case study for looking at the two types of motivations that I'm interested in, the utility ones and the inclusivity ones. So can we identify elements into the 40-hour work week that would render dyspraxia a disability beyond what beyond this kind of residual disadvantage? I will argue that yes, they are. If we look at the 40-hour work week as a social institution, which is to say including the accompanying norms, expectations, and attitudes that have been that are associated with the 40-hour work week, and including if we are to see the 40-hour work week as something that influences collective behaviors and equilibria that are formed around it. So I will be looking at the 40-hour work week as a social institution and argue that as a social institution, the 40-hour work week contributes to something that Alan Buchanan calls the infrastructure of interaction that shapes dyspraxia as a disability. So the infrastructure of interaction, as opposed to the physical infrastructure consisting of buildings, machinery, or access to ramps, that is more relevant if we look at different kinds of disability. For instance, mobility issues are intrinsically related to access to ramps. So in my case, I'll be focusing only on the infrastructure of interaction, and I'll be analyzing the 40-hour work week as a component of that. I will show that this infrastructure plays a significant role in rendering dyspraxia a disability. And I've identified 3 ways in which this happens. The first one has to do with the very measuring work performance for regular adults to quantify productivity. And this was, of course, what everyone does when they're trying to measure productivity in a workplace. You measure the average, and then you say that therefore for that workplace, this is the measure that is the most efficient one. But if you look at it from the perspective of people with disabilities within that workplace, you start to uncover ableist institutions. Because what this style of thinking does, which Ford participated in, but also these arguments or these experiments for the 4-day work week are doing, is that you're turning what is suitable for the majority into what is prescribed to everybody as a matter of norm. So statistical normality becomes a proxy for desirable functioning. And this is along the lines of the medical model of disability, in which which is the one that the social models are objecting to. And according to this medical and outdated model, you define disability as deviance from a norm that you measure in terms of what the majority in the population is able to do. So that the measurements of productivity fall straight into this way of thinking when you look at workers with disabilities. So the 40-hour work week operates with this normative model of human productivity, in which those who are unable to work for 40 hours are deemed as being not just different, but inferior, because they do not participate to what has been established as the norm. And this is problematic not just for dyspraxics, but also for people with energy limiting conditions, people who suffer from ADHD, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, as well as other health problems that prevent a full 40 hours of work activity. So these people could, of course, move on to part-time work, but we know that part-time work is not associated with the same status and the same benefits as full participation into the working week, at the same time that the working week is defined by the standards of the majority, which makes it an ableist institution. The second argument is that the 5-day work week is ableist also in virtue of the specific form that the standardization took, which is the 9 to 5 model of the working day, in which everyone flocks the offices at 9 in the morning, or used to before the pandemic, and then returns home in the early evening. And this is also credited to Henry Ford, and you can see why, because 9 to 5 happens to be the most productive time in everyone's working day. So of course you maximize productivity if you choose to get workers to be at the place of employment during their most productive hours of the day. But also, this model has a disciplining function if we look at it from the point of view of disability, because it increases pressures to coordinate between 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, in ways that increase stigma for poor timekeeping, which is a dyspraxic trait, but it is a trait that dyspraxia shares with, for instance, ADHD or other learning difficulties. And asking dyspraxic people to behave the same as others and to come in at 9 a.m. because that's when, I don't know, a meeting is, displaces cost for coordination onto dyspraxic people, not only because of timekeeping, because they are expected to arrive at work at the same time as other employees, but also because they are forced to rush through a routine that requires fine motor skills, dressing up, putting on makeup, finding their place of employment, even if they come there every day. You can have problems with this if you're dyspraxic. And of course, navigating objects is tested on public transport reaching work, because during rush hour you have these very narrow lanes if you're driving, or you're caught in between a lot of other workers if you're on the tube or in a bus. And if you're dyspraxic, that creates a lot of problems to orient yourself. You usually need a lot of free space around you to make sure that you can walk properly and not bump into anyone. And even then it's a challenge. So to have everyone coming into work and leaving at the same time creates additional problems for dyspraxic people, which turns the traits of dyspraxia into a disability. And finally, the 5-day work week assumes that whatever falls outside of time spent working is either rest or leisure, and the interpretation of what counts as work or leisure is always placed with the employer, which is why we don't count, for instance, time spent commuting as actual working time, because it doesn't matter from the point of view of the productivity of employers. And if you're dyspraxic, activities which should count as leisure are actually work. Even switching from work to leisure, switching between different modes, requires some planning capacities. As one dyspraxic person interviewed by the Dyspraxia Foundation put it, I still get emotionally overwhelmed by my dyspraxia, feeling mentally exhausted by things that many other people don't, such as balancing a working day with social obligations, packing a bag for the gym, or even brushing my teeth. So having to plan for leisure after work would also count as work if you're dyspraxic. And also, to the extent that dyspraxia is associated with sleeping difficulties, which can happen for various reasons, even rest takes work. So dyspraxics are more likely to invest in routines and to set aside time for an evening routine in order to be able to reliably wake up in the morning. So this definition of work as time spent in paid employment overlooks all other kinds of work that dyspraxic people are doing. So let me end with a brief discussion of how the 4-day work week can help. And there's one way in which even just cutting down the working week from 40 hours to 32 hours would help, because the reduction in hours makes some disadvantages associated with the requirement to be active for 40 hours disappear. And this would happen not just for dyspraxics, but for people with other disabilities as well. Everyone who falls into that category in which 40 hours is too much, but 32 hours is manageable. The potential for rest at leisure, so rest that does not require work, would increase from just 28.6% of the days of the week to 42.9%, which is significant. And since this move would be generalizable to the whole population, so everyone would only be working for 32 hours per week, the carers of disabled children would benefit from more time, including time to take children to occupational therapy, which could mean that essential routines are put in place earlier, and you don't have major problems of adjustment later on. And finally, given that a lot of dyspraxic people work overtime to make up for lost productivity, a 32-hour work week might just about come close to 40 hours work for dyspraxics. And this is something that has also been used as an argument for moving to a 40-hour work week, which is that people already spend about 7 hours time working outside of their place of employment. So if you cut the working week down to 32 hours plus the 7, you get close to a 40-hour work week. And this argument, of course, holds for dyspraxics as well, who try to make up for all these advantages by overworking all the time. But there's also an opportunity to have a 4-day work week. Oh, I can't move my slides now. And there are so few of them left, but I can't move my slides now. No, it disappeared. I will just tell you then. There is also an opportunity to move to a 4-day work week that is more inclusive, in which we emphasize not the efficiency for employers, but the ways in which employees would stand to gain by having a shorter working week. And this would require stopping the fetishization of a certain schedule from 9 to 5, trying to give more autonomy to all workers over where they would like to work and how they would like to divide their time, which is useful for all workers. And this is something that COVID-19 has made us rethink, who has autonomy, who has a say over where they work. But it's something that dyspraxic workers would benefit from. And finally, and most importantly, would bring back discussions of leisure to focus on a 4-day work week as something that needs to benefit employees, not just employers. And this would bring back the justification that Harold Cox and Sydney Webb were proposing initially for the 5-day work week, which is to allow everyone the opportunity for self-improvement and the opportunity for leisure, which is something that we don't get actually if we only focus on the benefits to employers. So this has been it. I'm sorry you couldn't see my final slides. I'm guessing that Alex will probably distribute them afterwards. And thank you, Alex, anyway, for being my assistant for the first half of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana, and I'm so sorry about the technical problems. But nevertheless, that was a really fantastic presentation, and it was really nice to get that background and context as well, which I think will set us up very nicely for the talks that are yet to come, as well as a discussion about all these issues you've raised here. So let's take 5 minutes, come back at 55 past the hour with questions, and we'll go from there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello. So, brilliant. These are exactly the sorts of issues that I think we need to be thinking about when discussing the policy recommendation that we'll have Joe Ryle advocating for this afternoon. So again, just raise your hands if you have things you'd like to ask Diana about. I sent out the, I put my own hand up because I will at some point definitely have things to ask. I sent out the slides by email if you'd like to look back over or look at those last ones that we unfortunately missed out on. Great, so let's start with Simeon Goldstraw.
Hiya, and thank you for that. I thought it was really interesting and like a really important discussion, like Alex just said there, to have. I had a quick reading recommendation, which, judging from like your start, you may well have seen, but if you haven't, a guy called Benjamin Klein Honeycutt did a lot of stuff in the 1980s, tracing like the 8-hour, like the origins of the 8-hour working week, and many of the things that you were touching on in the first couple of slides. So that might be worth taking a look at. And then I had a kind of general question, which was, you put forward very powerfully how the sort of the 5-day working week is ableist and sort of how the conventions can affect disabled people disproportionately. And then I just wondered, what's the advantage of, for example, going towards a 4-day week as opposed to just moving towards a much more kind of permissive, like ideal of flexible working, where people sort of like basically work kind of, it's much more accepted that people work as much and as little as they want, and they sort of like, and so yeah, there isn't that kind of same convention or expectation, and it seems that might fit the fact that some disabled people are going to be able to work more than others, and likewise, you think about single parents and that kind of thing. Why have sort of like one convention or like social benchmark at all, as opposed to just try and go for a much more permissive kind of ideal of flexible working?
Thank you so much for that, both for the recommendation. Let me first just make sure that I got the name correct. So Benjamin Klein, and then?
Honeycutt. So I think it's Hunnicut.
ICUT. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so I hadn't encountered that. I've only started looking into the genealogy of this a couple of weeks ago. So thank you so much for that. And thank you also for the question or the challenge, which I fully agree with. So I have to say that flexible working would be the ideal, allow every single individual to choose what works for them. So it's only because I'm only contrasting these two policy alternatives, the 5-day working week and the 4-day working week, that I find the 4-day working week preferable. And even here, I focus on the importance of having flexible working. So it's only because the 4-day working week is an alternative on the table, I guess, that I've chosen to focus on it. And it's only for reasons of feasibility, because I don't know whether this really ideal model in which everyone chooses to work for as much as they could be implemented, but the 4-day working week is within sight. So that's why I chose this. I am, as some of you know, also an advocate of universal basic income. So I don't think I could agree with you more than I do on the importance of flexible working. But yeah, so it was just a matter of comparing the two alternatives. But I fully agree with you.
Great, thank you. Otto.
Thanks. Hi, Diana. Well, actually, Simeon pretty much asked the question I wanted to ask, but just to add a little bit on that, that's kind of my concern as well. But do you think that in all respects, moving to, if we just talk in terms of we can't get to a flexible, adaptable workplace situation as we both would want to see happen, do you think that it's in all respects an improvement moving towards a 4-day Workweek? Because are we talking of an improvement for everybody who maybe has some issues with the current situation? Would we perhaps lose something as well? Would some people not benefit? So I'm more interested in this kind of comparative issue, and are there like pros and cons if we just think of these kind of default positions?
Yes, definitely. And this was in one of the slides, which unfortunately I couldn't get to for whatever reason. So I have to apologize again for the presentation being so difficult to follow. But I fully agree with the fact that there are also some things that we might lose if we move to a 32-hour week, because first of all, there might be an increased pressure for more coordination, which might lead to even more stigma for timekeeping, and getting to meetings, getting things done within a certain span of time. So that would be a danger for everyone who has coordination and timekeeping problems. There might be even more pressure to be productive at certain intervals because there's so much time outside of work that employers feel that they have no control over. And also, whereas with the 5-day working week, we have all these discussions about reasonable adjustment, it could be that if we move to a 32-hour working week, we would have the same inequalities persisting, but less reason to discuss them because they might turn into a privatized affair. Because if you have 3 days in which you're outside of work, it might become less important what happens to you when you are in paid employment. And I think this is all the more reason to advocate for an inclusive model and aim as much as possible for a model of flexible working than fetishizing a new schedule that is on the 4-day workweek model rather than the 3rd-day workweek model. But there are also some advantages associated with fewer days in which you're working, as I said. So if you move from the 5-day to the 4-day working model, keeping everything constant, you have advantages and disadvantages. But if you move to the 4-day work week and you emphasize the need for inclusivity rather than efficiency for employers, then I think you stand a good chance of retaining the advantages of the 4-day work week and mitigating the disadvantages.
Excellent. I've got Joe, I think, was next in the order. Joe Wolf.
Okay, thanks very much. So really interesting and very unusual to focus on dyspraxia, which is, I think, not exactly an invisible disability, but a much neglected one. And so it's great to get that on the agenda. I was going to ask Simeon's question, but I got a different one to ask you instead, which is if you go back to the motivation for the 5-day week from Henry, if I'd been around then, I think I would have said, well, why do you think what applies to the production line applies to all forms of work? And so I think I would ask you the same question. I mean, do the studies? I know we've got studies from Iceland. Which is rather extraordinary. It showed it was more efficient and then abandoned after the studies. It seems very strange that it wasn't picked up if it really did work. So I suppose that's two questions. Why wasn't it taken up once it was shown? And is there any reason to think that what's true for the studied forms of work will generalize to other forms as well? So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Excellent questions, both of them. Why not taken up? Well, if we look back at the motivation for the 5-day work week, and we look at all the experiments, it took something like 25 years, I think, between when Ernst Abbe designed his experiments and when Henry Ford finally concluded the same thing. And different workplaces were doing these experiments because partially they couldn't believe that 40 hours is more efficient than 120 hours, because it's against common sense. And what we see now is that a lot of countries or nations, including Scotland, are trying to are thinking of designing, just like UBI pilots, they're thinking of designing pilots to see if the 4-day work week might help. So I think it's because the notion that less is more is against common sense that we have this resistance to empirical fact, and we think, well, why maybe that can't be translated here, and we want to make sure. And I guess this also speaks to your second question, because I don't have a good answer, to the question, how do we know that what's true of one type of work would be true of another type of work? So I would also say leave it to empirical developments to see whether indeed different kinds of workplaces might benefit from this reduction, because it could be that we're moving to another paragraph. A kind of paradox. We had 120-hour work weeks, and then 40-hour was better, but actually 32 hours better than 40 hours. The point is 0 better than 32 hours. So many of these things will, I guess, benefit from doing empirical studies. But my point is that we should see these arguments about efficiency as something that doesn't work as the trump card that efficiency arguments usually play for disability. I think, Joe, in your own work on disability, you mentioned this example of someone who says, well, let's take the institution of contracts. We have people with severe cognitive impairments who are not benefited by the institution of contracts because they can't sign them. But what are we going to do now? Are we not going to have contracts anymore? No, because they're efficient. We need to have contracts. I don't know if you remember that argument.
It's Dan Wickler's argument, I think,
okay.
From paternalism and the mildly retarded, I think, from the 1970s. So not a paper title that you would use now.
Thank you for that. Yes, that's the one. So you have these arguments for inefficiency that usually act as a trump card for more inclusion for disabled people. So it's very good that now we have a focus on the increased efficiency of the 4-day work week. Wishful thinking there for 4-hour work week. But yes, what I'm saying is that these arguments for efficiency shouldn't replace the arguments for inclusivity.
Great. I was actually going to ask something about the efficiency arguments as well, so I might insert myself here. I'm really glad that you set it up in this way, because it seems like the campaigning, at least in Scotland, has been very focused on this efficiency issue. I had reservations about that for a different reason, so I thought I'll say what I thought about it and maybe see if you have anything to speak to it. So I was thinking in kind of macroeconomic terms. A 4-day work week, among other things, is a wage increase. It functions as a sort of wage increase. And it seems like, in economic theory, it looks like what's called an efficiency wage. I mean, if it works in the way that people are saying that it does, it works as a sort of efficiency wage. So if you believe in a market clearing wage for a given amount of labour, which I'm not sure I do, but let's pretend there's such a thing. You pay people above the market clearing wage and they work harder because they have more loyalty, or for whatever reason they're motivated to work more effectively and harder and more honest, be more honest about their timekeeping and things like that. And so you get this efficiency. But of course, I mean, what that also does is crowds up the labour market, because you're now paying each worker more for a given amount of labour, which means that there are fewer vacancies, or employers can afford to advertise fewer vacancies. And given what Joe was talking about yesterday, that when you have a crowded labour market, you disempower the labour force as a whole, even if you're empowering individual workers. And I suppose especially for workers with disabilities, you know, who are already kind of vulnerable to a highly competitive, but, you know, as much as we try to put in legal protections. So, I mean, you know, I guess this is an argument against the 4-day working week as such. I guess I just think it makes sense in the context of you do something in the workplace that then puts political pressure on a society to build, you know, a lot of institutional safeguards around it, you know, but on its own, I feel like it could have perverse effects potentially. I just wondered what, you know, what you thought of that, given the issues that you've been focusing on.
Thanks for that. It's a great worry to have about the 4-day work week. I'm not sure I can dispel it outright. I can take you back to the history of the 5-day work week, though, and hopefully there'll be some reassurance there. So just about the efficiency wage. There is an analysis of the 1914 change of profit sharing that Henry Ford did in terms of an efficiency wage. So I can point you to that article. I couldn't really follow the economics of it really well, but there is evidence. There is one analysis out there that I've encountered which says that that actually paying people in proportion to paying people more by maintaining the same price for a lower number of hours can actually act as an efficiency wage. But all I can do is point you to that article. Unfortunately, I don't master the economics behind it so much. And then it would be interesting to look at what has happened to the labor market back then in the 1920s. Because on the one hand, we know that part of the efficiency in Ford's factory might have been due to the fact that it was the most, that people were flocking and trying to get employed there. So the people who are chosen to work at Ford's factories then became the most motivated, educated, and so on and so forth, which contributed to the efficiency that he measured. But we don't know what effects that had on the rest of the working population. So I think that in this respect, the worry is a good one to have. The way of thinking that, for instance, Sidney Webb and Harold Cox were putting forward was a bit the opposite of this, and that's the common sense view. But the common sense view was disproven in terms of efficiency. So I don't know how that argument will stand, but I'll tell you what it is. So they were saying that even if you have you have employers paying more because they need to employ more people to do the same work. For instance, you had train drivers who train conductors working for 17 hours a day. So they had some of the longest working weeks out there. And in Scotland, there was a 5-week strike by train workers trying to get their hours reduced. So for those professions, it makes sense that actually if you get 2 people rather than 1 person to work the 17-hour shift, then you have just employers having to pay more. So it's not clear how efficiency would actually increase. And this is the common sense argument that we usually have about how, having 1 person paid £2,000 per month to work 17 hours, that's better than having 2 people pay the same to work for 17 hours. And they were saying that even though it would be inefficient, you would have effects that are positive for the community, because you would have a drop in unemployment. Because if you need 2 people to do the same job, then 1 person who would have otherwise been unemployed would now make it into the labor market. So this way of thinking would potentially appease the concern that you raised, at the same time that the starting premise is false, because the starting premise is that efficiency would be lost for employers if we reduce the working day. So I don't know where that leaves the argument. Really, I guess what we would need would be more research into the collective effects, but that's notoriously difficult to obtain, because all these experiments are limited in terms of time and impact. So I don't know if we could really do better than, oh, it makes sense, at the same time that we know that what makes sense is not a very good indicator for effects on reducing working time and productivity. So I don't know if this helps a lot.
Yeah, no, that does help a lot. I think also it's just hard to think about these things. I guess the proposal, well, maybe we'll see what Joe Ryle says this afternoon. I guess the proposal is, if everyone does exactly the same amount of work in 4 days that they were doing in 5 days, then there shouldn't be any employment effects overall. So it's a bit like the Sydney and Beatrice Webb argument, perhaps. Yeah. No, thank you for that. Graham.
Hi, Diane. Thank you for your presentation. At the beginning of the presentation, you made a reference to a recognition theory. Could you perhaps expand your thoughts on that?
Yes, I don't think I meant a reference to recognition theory in particular, but I do think that having disabled people in the labor market raises concerns that could be best dealt with by recognition. So I think that the sharpest point at which recognition makes an appearance would be when we contrast different ways in which we can cash out the 4-day work week. Because one of the problems that we would have with the 4-day work week that's just less of the same would be that you lose recognition for the problems of disabled people because they become privatized. Because most of these problems would happen on people's free time, rather than now you have 5 days in which disabled people's life would be impacted by working condition. If you reduce that to 3, if you reduce that to 4, then more of these problems would become invisible. And having this kind of displacement of disadvantages is something that matters from the point of view of recognition. And for disabled people, recognition is particularly important because for the longest time, you had misrecognition playing an active role in perpetuating disadvantage. So you would say, for instance, people with mobility issues, they never leave the house anyway, because you wouldn't see them on the street. But that meant you didn't invest in ramps, and you didn't invest in making buildings more accessible. And this is a recognition problem because you tend to paint people as they are in their excluded state, as disabled people, as well, these are people who chose certain kind of lifestyle because this is what best suits their condition. So if you privatize disabilities instead of looking at the societal way in which disabilities are constituted, first of all, this is a recognition problem, and secondly, this is an inherent part in what makes a disability a disability. So again, just from the perspective of the working week, I think recognition helps uncover this this danger with the less of the same model, if that helps.
Thanks. Let's see, Otto wants to come in, but could I actually just quickly clarify something? If we move everybody to a 4-hour, come do the same thing as you. We all have this repressed desire. If we move everybody to a 4-day working week, then presumably that gives all sorts of advantages to people, to able workers. That so it doesn't sort of level the playing field, or is the thought that well, not if it's just more of the or less of the same, as you say. But is the thought that it changes the way that we structure the workplace in a way that will allow us to rethink more fundamental structural features that could lead to more inclusivity? I think maybe I just missed this point.
Thanks for this. So if I understand correctly, you've now just identified another potential worry of the less of the same model, which is that you might actually have increased advantages for able-bodied people from the increased leisure time. Is that correct? Yeah, and I think that's an important point, especially since for disabled people or dyspraxics in particular, even socializing is work, because you increase this, and that's that's a very good point. I will write it down and acknowledge you, because this is a very, very good point about exclusion. But this only speaks to the advantages and disadvantages that cancel each other out, because on the one hand you can have inequalities resulting from this, but on the other hand you have actual rest that disabled people can enjoy more if they don't have to put in a lot of work into waking up at 9 a.m. They would enjoy this for 42.9% of their time, which is significant. So I don't know. It's also a matter of what happens with all the spare time that people have, again, thinking of collective results, because it could be that newer social institutions around leisure would develop, and then it might be considered part of what it is to have a good life, to participate in other kinds of things that are still work, for instance, volunteering. And because disabled people wouldn't do that, and then they might be excluded. So there are all kinds of dangers if we think about how these systemic effects would play out from the point of view of potentially, I don't know, weaponizing leisure, I guess, in a way that turns leisure time into a struggle for recognition, speaking to the earlier question. And then we would have people with disabilities losing out. So I think that's a very good point. I will mention it as a potential disadvantage of the 4-day work week on the less of the same model, but the inclusive model, as long as it's only focused on the workplace, wouldn't help appease these concerns completely either. It would be mostly about the shift in what is important and giving preeminence to individual concerns that hopefully, and this is what the inclusive model does, and hopefully that would permeate discussions about leisure as well. There's no guarantee about societal effects, I would say, either way. It's a very good point. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Otto.
Thank you. Well, so this is kind of a general question regarding the general theory of the sort of public recognition and public accommodation of disabilities and putting that into practice. And I guess my question is about the demandingness of your view on this, and what is the threshold or sufficiency level, or is there such, for thinking of what counts as being sufficiently institutions sufficiently recognize or sufficiently accommodate? Because you can think of kind of the equivalent of a utility monster objection, right, where you have one person with such severe disabilities that it becomes extremely costly for society to accommodate them in the workplace or in infrastructure. And so I guess the question is, what counts as society doing enough to accommodate for disabilities for you? Thanks.
Wow, Otto, that's a very complicated question. I don't know. I don't know if I have a very good answer to that. Also because it's notoriously difficult to specify a way in which, you know, the most accessible society looks like, because different disabilities would require different accommodations. So if we are to take just the examples that I mentioned as the ones that on the disability spectrum would be the easiest to accommodate, deafness and dyslexia, they lead to completely different accommodations. So to best accommodate dyslexia, you have to go to verbal communication. If we go to verbal communications, then deaf people wouldn't be able to take part in most of the communication that would happen, and they would benefit from having things written down. So it's a notoriously difficult question to answer. You know, what's the most accessible society out there? So I guess I'm saved by the fact that I take such a focused approach on this new proposal that we have now, which is on the four-day work week, because for this one I can, and I also take one specific disability, and for this one I can pinpoint to ways in which we have dangers, and even here I haven't thought of all of them. So Alex has just suggested a very powerful one, and what could be improved, but I don't have a very good answer for how the best or the most inclusive society would look like. And some of the conversations that we have now shows why that is, because systemic effects are very important in determining all those social institutions that make up disabilities as disadvantages that people with impairments suffer from. So it's very difficult to tell. When Elizabeth Anderson visited our department at King's, Otto, this is one of the discussions we had. We were because, well, we had Elizabeth Anderson speaking at the department that Otto and I used to be part of at King's, and then she would meet some people you had to book and have a one-to-one person, and I took that opportunity. And what we did was just dream for about 15 minutes about what a society of equals would look like. And she gave me some references of some really good people who were dreaming up this stuff in the 18th and 19th century. And if you haven't been there, it's really impossible to tell how it would look like. And so one of the references that she suggested there was something about gender, an appeal made by half of the human race for the other half. And even for gender, where you know, it's you don't have the range of differences that we have in disability, it's difficult to imagine what it would look like. But to imagine it for all disabilities simultaneously, I don't know. But we can dream on.
Thanks.
A lovely note to end the session, I think. So thank you again to Diana, to all of you for.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so sorry about the slides. I hope
yeah,
you.
I'm sorry about that too. But more control when it's in person over technical things, but we're at the mercy of Microsoft. But I will again jump over onto Gathertown. If anyone wants to chat informally, can be there. And otherwise, we'll see you at 2:30 for Joe Ryle on the 4-day week campaign. So a nice continuation.